Land has been a vexed question for a long time in South Africa. It has defined our politics and continues to inform our economic system. The latent racial tensions flare up whenever the question of land arises because the majority landowners in the country are the minority of the white community. But there is more to the land debate, and one person who has studied and commented on the land question is Wandile Sihlobo, an agricultural economist with AgBiz. He was also on the President's panel on land review, and I learned that actually the work is not completely done. They still have got a few T's to cross and I's to dot. Please join us on the network using social media. The hashtag is the Modise Network. We welcome your comments. Wandile, a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Pratim.
Sure, Wandile. And I said that you are one person who's commented on land. And from a distance, I've always been curious to know what your interest is and has been in agriculture. How did you get to be the agricultural economist that you are?
Sure, Pratim, I never really thought studying at university that I would end up in the ag sector. I mean, I started on in accounting, and obviously as time goes by in the first semester, I changed and I went to BSc in economics and agriculture. It was at the time when there was starting to be the whole thing about global food crisis, and it looked interesting, the stories that were happening and the developments globally, and I ended up getting on agriculture. And I've since then progressed in that route, and there's always been these new challenges and interesting stuff. So it's really a good field. And I think for South Africa, given that agriculture is still very much part of development and also either you're bringing people on the labor market, so it's a really interesting field, which I think is critical for our economy. So,
but you know, certain things that we see in people when they're older and very active were planted when they were young. I suspect that suddenly when you take to something so passionately as you do, and I read your columns, your articles, and I've seen your star rise in this area of agriculture, that I suspect at some point when you were still a child, a seed was planted.
It might have been. I mean, you growing up in the Eastern Cape, you might be studying in a certain urban area side, but obviously you get to be involved in agriculture, but still at a small scale farming side. So as you progress and you get to education and you understand the intricacies of that and how that links to economic development, I think that's where the whole drive comes about.
Now, the discussion around land mainly focuses on agriculture, or people think that when you say land, you mean all land for agriculture, but land is being used for a variety of things, right? And with such urbanization taking place, not only in South Africa, the rapid migration that is taking place in South Africa and the rest of the world, land is used for a variety of things. There's commercial use, there's mining, there's agriculture, and the rights are different from place to place. Just unpack the way we should understand the land question before we get to the details of it.
No, I mean, I would say broadly, when people talk about land reform, I think agriculture gets to be more prominent, mainly because it occupies a larger space of South Africa. For example, we're a country of about 122 million hectares, so 68% of that is agriculture, so you would understand that. And I think also the fact that agriculture is much more unionized, so their voice is able to really ascend the other voices. But when we look at the land reform, or the question of land reform, we're looking both urban as well as on a rural side setting, like you just rightly said now. So I think that people have to have appreciation of both of those things. And I mean, you do see this when you look at the demand issue. People talk about land hunger and land evasion. And those invasions, when you look at it, they really happen in an urban area side, where I think as we approach and as we get to discuss about this, we should really place more emphasis there, because it seems that people want to be closer to where they work, and those needs to be addressed, not only to focus on the farming side. So we were really pulling both of these things in both hands.
There's the question of ownership as well. The shorthand is to say the majority of land is owned by white people and just smaller pieces by black people, and therefore that is at the center of the problem. But I think it is much more complicated than that, isn't it? I mean, you also have got the authority or rights over land, whether it should be the traditional leaders, whether it should be the government, and there are things like water rights in the case of mining and mining companies. Just to give me the nature or the sense of ownership of land in South Africa, including the structural makeup of such ownership?
No, I mean, look, the statistics as to say who owns what has been progressed, we don't have good data, to be quite frank with you. You have the government coming up with their numbers saying they have 9% or so, 13%, depending on who you're speaking to. And you have the private sector guys where Agri-SA would throw up their own numbers. And you have our side, some of the work that we have done with my colleagues at Stellenbosch University, where we'd come up with about 21% of the land being the one that has already been bought from 1994 up until today. But all of those numbers, they linked certain assumptions that gets to be pulled on because of the nature of the statistics. But what we can all agree on is that we still have a very much skewed ownership of the patterns towards the white population of South Africa, which is why we are having this conversation that we're having now. For example, if I were to look briefly at the work that we're doing with the panel, we're considering some of those things. And the issue of the equal distribution or fair distribution of land is one of the key issues that we're looking at. And also the issue of saying, okay, will people have access to land only, or will you begin to really make sure that they have some bit of ownership? Because at the end of the goal, at the day, you want people to be able to use the land for some useful economic activity. So we could begin to see some rise in living standards. So those are some of the things that we're really looking at. The goal is to make sure that people use the land productively and they get to improve their economic standard. Either some benefit through jobs or some they get to be involved in activities. So we're looking at the whole of this.
Well, let's look at the politics of it, right, of land, and the way the question of land ownership is being debated and crafted in South Africa. As I said earlier, that it appears to me that we are simplifying it. It could be more complicated than we imagine. And I'll give you an example, right? If you travel through the Northern Cape or fly over the Northern Cape, you see empty spaces of land. And I suppose it's the same even over the Knysna and the other parts of the country. So then the question becomes, who owns the Northern Cape? Yeah, let's use the Northern Cape as an example. And if the Northern Cape is unoccupied, does it mean I can up and leave Joburg and go and choose a nice piece of land or whatever, large tracts of land there, and say, I now own this land from now on?
No, but Tim, there's systems that we're pretty much using on that. And I wouldn't necessarily say there are pieces that are just lying relatively out there without any ownership. You do find some of the other pieces of land, some that are, you'll see forest and mountainous area. Those were largely under the state. And there will be some that are under private ownership, depending if it's farms or rural areas and all of those things, which links back again to the issue of data that we're talking about. But the question now, for example, look what the ruling party was saying. They're targeting underutilized land, unused land, vacant land spaces to be some of the pieces of land that we should really start to look at it and say, how do we begin to make sure that there's some productive activity here, bringing on some other people who might assist on that. So that is part and parcel of
and that's why I say the politics of land, you see, of land ownership, that sometimes you wonder, and you probably had to go back at the very beginning to understand the question itself, that when people talk about land ownership, what do they have in mind? What are they anticipating? If you live in, let's say, Gauteng, and you're talking about a land ownership, that you want land to be restored to you as compared to the Eastern Cape or Limpopo or KZN, and you live under the Ingonyama Trust, you're talking about the same thing, but it means different things, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, Bratim, the best way to look at this is the fact that to appreciate we're looking at land at the moment in South Africa, or land reform, in three pillars. The redistribution is the one where we say, hey, let's cut this cake and make sure that everyone has a share, benefits from it. Then you're looking at the issue of restitution, where you can really go and claim and say your family owned a certain piece of land, and there are procedures to do that. As to whether they get to be effective or not, that's the debate for another day. But obviously there is the issue of restitution. We'd really make sure that people should get some bit of a tenure, title deeds over that piece of land, so they can invest and do all of those things, which somewhat speaks to the issue of Ingonyama Trust you were saying. For example, in my home province in the Eastern Cape, where you have many people in all of these former homelands that are challenged by that particular issue. So I think you look at it in that prism of all of those three dynamics. But here in Gauteng, for example, the issue of tenure gets to be important, but also the issue in Gauteng of redistribution, of people really wanting to find a space in this cake that we are having here. Can they get a slice here and there? What must happen for them to get there? Which is the work that we're beginning to do, to say, okay, how do you operationalize the big vision of the land reform to make sure that practically, what do you mean when you're giving some of these things? So those are where the thoughts are coming from, and either it's outside or it's in panels. That's the real thinking that now is going on.
And the way we live and work in South Africa has got a bearing on this whole question. Again, Gauteng comes as an example, or the Western Cape, right? If you live in Gauteng and your home province is, let's say, Eastern Cape or KwaZulu-Natal, and you're talking about land ownership, what do you understand people to be saying? They want land in Gauteng and Eastern Cape, or they want it in one province, or they want it wherever they want it, or from the discussions that you've had with the different stakeholders, what sense are you getting?
No, I think Pratim, the picture is pretty much mixed. It's broad-based. In the Eastern Cape, for example, you would find people who want to go and farm in certain areas, but those lands, some of it falls under the state, and now they're currently leasing. Some of it is obviously communal land, which by virtue, if you look at administratively, it will be under the state. So they really want to go and occupy that land and begin to do some productive activity. In Gauteng as well, in the peripheries, you do find people who want to occupy those pieces of land, but also you do see in the urban spaces where people really need shelter and all of those things. So that's why I was saying the picture is really mixed. You can't really say this is province for farming, this is the area for housing. The picture is mixed.
I appreciate that, and it's complicated. Again, I take it back to the people, and please bear with me. Because when you have, let's say, land invasions happening in the urban areas, people justify that by saying, well, we want land, and we're taking our land back. Do you think that's a constructive approach to sorting out the land question?
I don't think it's a constructive approach to invade land and get to just get into any place. But at the same time, I would like to place more urgency to the policymakers and the system that are supposed to work so that people could begin to see some bit of an improvement, which I think, by the way, is beginning to happen now. With all of these urgent cases that we've seen across the country, they've forced the pressure for people to really start thinking productively about this issue. But I wouldn't necessarily encourage that we invade piece of land, but we should keep the discussion going so that we can begin to see some fruitful step which will begin to respond to the needs of the people on what do people really want. Do we have a capacity to address those? What needs to be in place? Which is where I think the discussion right now is heading to.
Wandile Sihlobo is my guest, and we will be continuing our conversation regarding land issues and the work that the panel review on land is busy with, as well as his thoughts on the productive use of land. And we'll continue our conversation in a moment.